last year. It's hard to believe it's already the fourth edition, and uh, I hope it is one of the last such reports on the monitoring of the seven recommendations, because we have quite ambitious goals for the current year, and we are in line with the Ukrainian government's goals at large. The idea is to get the political decision on the part of the European Union on the initiation of negotiations. So we are expecting the final report of on the seven recommendations, then the a statement in June. Well, some political obligation of the European Union to launch the negotiations this year, or at least to make a final decision this year. And if we have, of course, the positive report on the seven recommendations, and also positive report in October, the Commission of Europe will be publishing this for every candidate. And so we need to make sure that there is positive assessment
ЄС,
there.
що виконання
And we understand, and we are being
відкриття
told
вступних
from the
переговорів,
EU
але з іншого
countries that the implementation of those seven recommendations does not automatically imply the launch of negotiations, but still we understand that if we do complete this, then in this case, even the largest skeptics will have challenges with both and any obstacles to the negotiations. So we are very careful and serious about this monitoring, and the purpose behind this initiative, as we have emphasized on numerous occasions, is not only to conduce the implementation of certain recommendations, not only to inspire, but I just don't like the word pressure, but yes, we are up there to motivate the Ukrainian government and institutions to effectively implement these recommendations, and not to do this like a mere formality, but also uh, there is a similar process in there, some visits are planned to Netherlands and Germany and some other EU member countries, where we are going to present candidate CHECK-4. So this communication tool is very important to us. So over the time of the preparation of this candidate check, we have developed a kind of a kernel of this coalition, because they have professional sectoral aspects and associations, and it's not only about their professional level, it's also about how passionate they are about implementation of reforms in Ukraine and Ukraine's accession to the EU. So the largest challenges, to be completely honest with you, the largest challenges in our coalition is how to find the balance between the formal assessment of a certain recommendation completion and the qualitative implementation, because, well, the formal implementation of a recommendation does not always imply a quality change of reform at large. So we need to find some balance here, because at this stage, for sure, we understand that we cannot, over such a brief period, to have a high quality implementation of a certain reform, but we also want to start the accession negotiations with the EU. And also, if we are only formally implementing a recommendation, we also have the understanding that we will get back to the same reform to the same reform at a certain point later, and it's much easier to uh, do something from scratch than to redo it later, and especially when it has to do with supremacy of law or anti-corruption, etc. So we do understand that even if we do not implement this today, we will have to do it later at the stage of fundamentals, which is a part of the accession negotiations. So we will come back um, to this at some point, and this is why it's better to do everything well from the very beginning. And we understand that these 7 recommendations are a great chance for Ukraine to undergo in-depth transformation, and we need to use this opportunity. So, looking into the results of the most recent fourth candidate check, we can see some positive dynamics, and it is uh, quite good news, although it's not as positive as we would want it to be. And there are some challenges. There are some most pressing issues with certain recommendations, and the reform of the Constitutional Court remains the most challenging recommendation that there are 4 recommendations in which we are approaching to the completion of their implementation, and this is an optimistic signal. So the know-how of the current edition of the candidate check is that we have changed the methodology of the session of one of the recommendations, and specifically it is de-oligarchization. We have basically decided not to assess it, and my colleagues will explain why we are taking this unconventional step. And I also would like to specify that the critical remarks in the preparation of the current edition of the candidate check were not only aimed at certain Ukrainian institutions, but also the Venice Commission and the European Commission, which shows that it's indeed an independent commission, independent of the Ukrainian government, but also independent of the European institutions, the Venice Commission. So quite often the mm, requirements set by the experts are higher than those mm, than those of the European Commission and the Venice Commission. So let us give the floor to Mariana Vapordinova, who will be our today's moderator, who will introduce to us the experts taking part in the discussion. Some of them are already with us, but they are currently having a meeting with the Venice Commission on the Constitutional Court, which once again reiterates the importance of the assessment made by our experts concerning the implementation of the um, recommendations. So thank you so much once again, dear experts. Thank you so much, dear candidate checkers. And let's give the floor to Mariana. Thank you, Alona. Hello, dear colleagues. Hello, dear audience. Thank you for joining our event today. This is an event by the New Europe Center. I would like to give the floor to the invited experts who will unveil more detail about each of the specific reforms. But first, I'll mention that the expert panel is quite limited today, although, as Alena mentioned in her introduction, Candidate Check is an initiative where about 10 think tanks taking part. There is a big number of experts participating, but today their functions were delegated to a couple of colleagues who will present the results. So this event is initiated by a Center New Europe. It's uh, taken part within a project implemented by PACT in Ukraine, implemented with support with the United States and Development Agency. And we would like now to give the floor to Yulia, who has been taking part in the previous event. I hope she will unveil some details about that. So Yulia is taking care of the area of national minorities. In December last year, Ukraine has approved the necessary legislation, but there were also some remarks about it from the European Union. So let us hear from the expert if the new legislation actually meets the requirements of the EU. Thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you so much for having this seventh criterion on the national minority being considered as the first one today. So it is actually, I believe it is indeed one of the most important ones, although it is mentioned in the list last. So we have made the assessment over this quarter, and our assessment is more or less the same as in the previous period. It doesn't mean, though, that the implementation processes were not happening. So, indeed, in December last year, the new law on national minority and national minority communities was approved. Right now, the concept of the government project is developed to put in place implementation mechanisms to make sure this law is put into action. So there is also a 10-year program that's going to aid for the different areas of this law. So are there any challenging issues there? Well, these remarks of different countries, specifically the neighboring countries, about Ukraine's imperfect legislation on national minorities, they have quite a long history. And of course, this could be a subject of a separate discussion. But right now, as far as I can understand, the focus is made on ensuring education for national minorities. And this issue is also being regulated, but actually it's not being regulated by this law in question, because this requirement number 7, it's not only about the law on national minorities, it's also about they have to do with a law on education, with the higher education, with the secondary education, the law on the media, the law on the protection of Ukraine's language. So this is a broad socio-cultural field that needs to be defined in the law so as to avoid gaps concerning national minorities. So, for instance, Hungary has issues with education in the language of national minorities, in this case, in Hungarian language. And also, there was a transitional period for the schools in which education is provided in the languages of the EU, such as Hungarian. This period can be prolonged because of the war and because of COVID-19 pandemic. So, because of that, there are certain implementation challenges and subsequent steps need to be made. Now, in terms of implementation and in terms of the sublaws that could ensure this work and the more understandable mechanisms for communication between the minorities and the government and the support of the minorities by the Ukrainian government through grants and maybe support through some cooperation between minorities and government authorities. So this section number 7, I mean the requirement number 7, it's not only about the minority legislations, but it's about the Ukrainian society at large and the legislation regulating it and the legislation for the national majority. So it should be a topic of a broad discussion, and true democracy is defined by how the rights of minorities are ensured. So we need to find a certain balance, I mean, not between the rights of the minorities and the majority, but also about the development of some realistic implementation mechanisms. So when we had at the beginning of the development of this law, this was the pre-war time, so to speak. Right now, we have additional consequences of war that we also have to deal with and that also have to do with impacted minorities in Zaporizhia, in the Kherson Oblast, also the destruction of the heritage of these national minorities. So it's not only about the specific mechanisms for the implementation of this legislation, but it's also about finding answers to questions about harmonious development and realization of rights of every ethnic group in Ukraine. So the changes are happening and, well, they are still underway. So, indeed, the Venice Commission is holding consultations today, consultations with different stakeholders in terms of the assessment of the legislation, including the legislation on national minorities. They encourage to trust only the official information that's going to be published on their resources rather than some texts that are published in less trusted sources. So the Venice Commission is right now considering the legislation of non-national minorities. So yeah, let's summarize so in one sentence. What is the expert assessment of the stage of this reform? Well, it is underway. The priority is being implemented. That's correct, but it has to have more steps uh, to have this implementation ensured. The concept and the program approved, and also there needs to be the decision of the Venice Commission. Yeah, let me briefly remind you that the assessment of some progress is happening. Thank you, Yulia. And right now, I would like to discuss one more reform one of the most successful ones. So it is the media legislation reform, and it is 9 points. Let's hear from Sergei Serdorenko because, well, Sergei, we were discussing before the part of candidate check that media legislation reform is one of the most successful ones, but even here we still do not have 10 out of 10. So what should Ukraine do in this area? And uh, what is your comment on the change of our assessment methodology in the anti-oligarch reform? Let us hear from you on this as well. Well, welcome everyone. And let me add just one sentence to the previous remarks by Yulia. So, what is happening in the minorities legislation reform? The coalition believes that it is indeed one of the most successful criteria for Ukraine because if we look into the exact requirements set out by the European Commission, we are very close to the actual implementation, although sky is always the limit. But speaking of the media legislation reform, we again don't intend to uh, make some ideal situation in the media legislation. We are first and foremost implementing the requirements of the EU, and well, their audiovisual legislation is quite a serious reform for us. This is something that we were thinking about for maybe 10 years each time this was considered. It was deemed impossible because the oligarchs, owners of the TV channels, were against. But right now, during this full-scale war, we are finally successful. We already have 9 points out of 10, and the only thing that is not ready yet is one additional piece of legislation, which is the law on advertising, and it has been approved in the first reading in this plenary week. It is less than ideal, but as far as I am aware, as so far as I have learned from the MPs, they understand the recommendations of the European Commission, and I truly hope that this will be taken into account. So this has to do with a more serious ban on tobacco advertising. And in this case, at least in one of the recommendations, Ukraine will confidently have 10 out of 10. So we will be watching this. But speaking of the plans of the Ukrainian parliament, they intend to complete this part by the end of May. And that's very important because in June there will be preliminary assessment by the European Commission. So we, as a state, have to manage to complete this step uh, by that time. And this looks realistic. So fortunately, we have a success story here. So the only thing that I can add here is that it's not only the assessment of Ukrainian experts who believe that reform is implemented in line with the European requirements, but also the joint assessment of the European Commission and the Council of Europe. They had a positive opinion on this. So now answering your question about the anti-oligarch reform, that's a very important issue here, and it's great that Alana has mentioned it in the beginning. So we faced a unique situation. Ukraine would like to implement the European Union's criteria for the implementation for the beginning of the negotiations, but but the obstacle we are facing comes from the European Union itself. So they have made a political decision to require this anti-oligarchs legislation because there is indeed a hot issue with this. So they had this political right and they used it. But the criterion was shaped in such a way that to implement it, Ukraine has to implement the de-oligarchization law in line with recommendations of the Venice Commission. But although this criterion has been proposed 10 months ago or almost 11 months ago, there is still no recommendation on this from the Venice Commission. And there is a number of reasons for this uh, that give us reason to believe we will not get these recommendations till the end of this year. And even if they provide these recommendations tomorrow, we will still have no chance to implement this so quickly because it takes time to implement such changes, which basically means that Ukraine, not for its own fault, can fail to implement this criterion for the start of negotiations. We, as a coalition, believe it is not acceptable, and we insist that the European Union has to take this into account. So, in the preliminary assessment, we only had 2 out of 10 for this criterion, but this is something that cannot continue this way, and it was a unanimous decision of our coalition. In the presentation of this candidate check, we will address our European partners with a request to provide additional detail for this criterion because the situation has actually changed. Not only do we have the issue with the ruling of the Venice Commission, we still have some changes in the situation with oligarchs' influence. The problem is still there, and something that needs to be done in our government, but one cannot fail to notice that the influence of oligarchs has during the war because much of their property was destroyed, and even without enacting the true anti-oligarchs law, we still have at least 2 oligarchs who have potentially left some property in their media empire, and the media right now are much less impacting the
ЄС має в принципі переглянути цей.
And we believe that the EU has to reconsider this criteria based on the current situation. Maybe they should set a different de-oligarchization criteria. Maybe they should have a political decision that the fulfillment of this criteria will not have any impact on the accession negotiations, but still they would need to send a signal to the coalition. Well, thank you, Sergei, to such a comprehensive overview of reforms. And indeed, I would like to mention that all these anti-corruption reforms, they rank high at the monitoring process, and there's 3 reforms covering this aspect, and we can see a different progress in this direction. This anti-oligarch reform, as Sergei has already mentioned, it's been sort of frozen in terms of the assessment and the monitoring. Then the reform designed to further improve NABU and SAP operations. At this point, we can see some progress. Still, the anti-laundering reform has some difficulties, I would say, and so I'd like to pass the floor to Alexander Kolentenkos. He's the senior analytics from Transparency International Ukraine. He was one of the inspirers to the idea of the new methodology to the assessment of the candidate check. So, Alexander, please, I would like to invite you to the floor. Please share your own thoughts and the joint position of Transparency International and the Center for Fighting the Corruption. That's on the anti-corruption reforms. Thank you, Mariana, and greetings. Now, talking on the anti-corruption reforms, we have some sort of a formal fulfillment of 2 out of 3 parts of these recommendations, because in addition to the earlier appointed head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, now there's a new appointment, the director for the NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Surely, there are some notes of the experts as to how this appointment took place and the procedure for the competition. There were no substantiation for why the committee has selected the 3 sort of candidates for the further consideration to the appointment. So there were not so many expectations fulfilled in terms of the experience of the candidates, and the new director of the NABU will have to demonstrate his competence and political independence, but that already violates these recommendations. But even though we have the appointment, as for the third part of the recommendations, we can see that NABU, SAP, and the anti-corruption court, they are very effective in terms of top corruption cases, because this part, which is to reinforce the anti-corruption measures through effective investigations, to provide the sentences, provide court hearings, and we could see that a lot of cases have been instigated against the ex-Deputy Minister of Defense. Some of the cases were submitted for court hearings. There were cases against the Verkhovna Rada MPs, and there were a lot of cases against the MPs, against the other deputies. So we have the dynamics, but this recommendation is a fairly wide. So I would say that a significant progress in the other spheres is yet to, well, to appear. And then there's another priority that we talk for a period of time. That's the reestablishment of the electronic submittance of declarations, because these electronic declarations is very effective tool primarily for the fulfillment of this recommendation on the reinforcement of anti-corruption measures through effective investigations. Because, I mean, you can't do effective investigations when the public officials are not submitting their declarations. So the law enforcement agencies simply don't have access to these declarations because they were not submitted. There's 2 articles of the Criminal Code of Ukraine which is failing to submit declarations and providing the false information in these declarations. I mean, they will not work simply, and they will for effective investigations because of the lack of those declarations. Now, one more thing. That's in terms of these investigations, it's all related to the capacities of the law enforcement agencies to do these investigations. And at this point, we have to mention that there's still an issue with NABU being able to do the tapping for the communications on an independent. Now it's a matter of proper funding. There is also a matter of institutional autonomy for the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. There's a number of issues with the medical examinations, with the time frames. There's also the question with regards to the detailed statistics in order to trace all of those investigations and monitor them, meaning the publication and then detailed statistics on the investigation, pre-trial investigation, because that would allow to document the progress that have been achieved in Ukraine. Some steps have already been made, and this is highly welcomed, but the recommendation, well, the fulfillment of this recommendation is already because the director of the NABU has been appointed. But in terms of restoring the declarations, well, at this point, there's still the situation which is unchanged. Now, as for the reform in the field of countering the money laundering process and the alignment of the legislation to the font standards, at this point, we don't have any, well, significant progress, I would say, that we can already, try and check, because the main challenge about this legislation that we've already mentioned previously is that they, there were some amendments introduced by the MPs that are weakening the monitoring of the public like agents, because they are no longer considered public agents after 3 years after they're no longer being like a public officer. And that's contrary to the font standards. But at this point, we have not registered any draft laws in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on correcting this situation, but we have some positive signals. We've heard some positive signals from the government, and already there's an attention to this problem. It's on the agenda as of now, and therefore we have not yet changed our assessment because the law still remains as it is. But as I've said, there's already some positive trends in terms of the need to resolve this issue. This recommendation has been provided, like together with the law enforcement sector reform. So that's sort of a combined recommendation covering both of those aspects. And at this point, we have not seen any significant progress. For example, there was a draft law on the comprehensive strategic plan for the reform of the law enforcement sector of Ukraine. So that was developed back in January. And in January, we've heard that this document is submitted for the consideration of the presidential office, but it's already May, and we don't have any information about approving of this project in the office of the president. But the EU is expecting the fulfillment of this recommendation by September this year, so hopefully the Ukrainian authorities will hear those recommendations by the EU and it will approve the action plan for the fulfillment of this comprehensive strategic plan for the reform. And then there has to be a reform of the security service of Ukraine on the agenda. You know, a lot of conversations are about this a reform, so it has to be provided, and the font will assess that reform as 6 points in terms of the effectiveness of its implementation. Well, thank you for providing us with the overview on the situation in the anti-corruption. So we have one more speaker, one more expert, Mikhailo Hornyakov. He's the head of the de jure organization, and now I'd like to have a conversation on the supremacy of a law reform. And this is considered one of the most important reforms for further EU integration. So, Mikhailo, over these past 4 candidate checks, we were talking that there is a certain disbalance in terms of the fulfillment of the first and second recommendation, that in terms of the Constitutional Court, the progress was far slower, while the recommendation on selecting the members for the High Qualification Commission and High Court of Justice, there were far more significant progress. I know that previous meeting with the Venice Commission. So, Mikhailo, you have the floor. Please, could you provide us with the overview on the experts' assessment? Because we've done that assessment together with many organizations. So, Mikhailo will be able to speak on behalf of the different experts. Well, Greetings to everyone. Indeed, I have to thank the New Europe Center and to all those participating, because that's not only a joint project. This is a wonderful way to think of others, because sometimes we are being heavily criticized for criticizing others, but sometimes, you talk to colleagues, and this is the joint assessment we've done all together. And Mariana was absolutely right to mention there is a disbalance in between of the first and the second recommendations. The first is the reform of the Constitutional Court and the selection of the judges in accordance to the recommended procedures. And the other is the rebooting, so to say, of the High Council of Justice and the High Commission. And in terms of implementation, we have some achievements. So this is the process that we've started back in 2021 in accordance to the previous legislation. That was a sort of a compromise legislation. And we can see already some progress in terms of High Council of Justice. And right now, there's already a final stage for High Qualification Commission. They have to select the 16 members. There's some particularities involved, and one of the very interesting candidates who has already underlined his independence, he had some very strange questions yesterday, but still there is a progress and a lot has been achieved, and we are on the final stage of the implementation of these recommendations. But the situation with the Constitutional Court is different. So we put 2 out of 10 points. Of course, we would be happy to give a higher assessment, but unfortunately, there's no significant achievements. Because Serhi mentioned that in accordance with the recommendations of the Venice Commission, but there's no recommendations of the Venice Commission. So, unfortunately, the recommendations of the Venice Commission are not available, and there will be a seventh opinion of the Venice Commission, or at least an official document that we are aware of. But the law and the legislation is becoming worse and worse. What am I talking about? On the 17th of December 2022, the Venice Commission had an opinion, and it said that there has to be 7 members for the selective commission, and the seventh sort of member of this commission has to be provided by the international experts. And that is in order to prevent any controversies with the process, so that the members of the Constitutional Court will not be politicized. Then the EU is publicly saying that there has to be 7 members, but unfortunately the law that we have, and it was appointed 3 days before the opinion of the Venice Commission. It does not take into consideration their opinion, and there is a special letter saying that. So when the Venice Commission was suggested to join this process, and they said that we're not going to participate in this process because your legislation does not correspond to our opinion. So this law that was appointed doesn't make us closer to fulfillment of the Venice Commission opinion, but in fact, it goes contrary to their opinion. So what we can say, like, there is the voting procedure, another aspect. So we have 3 international members, 3 Ukrainian members, and the decisions are made by the standard majority. But at least that means that any independent candidate simply won't be able to join the Constitutional Court. Now, the government has registered the draft law 9225, and it does not include the seventh member, but they changed the rule for the voting. And in order for a candidate to be voted for, he would need to have 5 votes in favor. So after all these critics, after all these recommendations, the government is registering the draft legislation, which is making the situation even worse. So on the one hand, we understand this sort of intent, because that is the intent by some of the political forces to establish control over the members of the Constitutional Court, because the government still controls the 5 available vacancies, and if there will be a formula for the government when the government will be able to appoint his own people, then it means that they would have a control over the Constitutional Court for at least another 8 years. And that's the tenure for the constitutional judges. But we understand how this would help Ukraine to continue to develop, and we don't understand how this would help to the EU, Ukraine's integration to EU. Even if we'll have an accession negotiations, then we will not be able to have this accession because we don't have the reforms, because the constitutional court, which is politically kind of motivated, will simply kill all the reforms. And there's already a lot of issues, and we won't be able to have the EU membership. It will not have a supremacy of the law. And another problem, as Olena has mentioned, is that unfortunately both the EU and the Venice Commission are over favorable in terms of the Ukraine's reform of the constitutional court. And we believe that what is happening is that we have a sympathy as a country which is defending uh, itself and others from Russians. And we are having some additional bonuses in terms of the reforms that allows us to sort of offering with some vague initiatives. So what you can see now is for the Venice Commission and the EU to step down and to say that 6 candidates is also possible within the frames of the Ethical Council, even though that was not the best possible option. So as of now, the Venice Commission has made the representatives of the civil society now, and the Venice Commission is ready to hear us. At a certain point, they understand the complexities of the situation, and very soon there will be a preliminary opinion, yet another opinion, and then it has to be adopted on the 10th and 12th of June. And we don't know what would be recommendations of the Venice Commission, but there is already recommendation on the model of the Ethical Council, which we believe is too risky for the Constitutional Court. So the question is remains open, but we are assessing the governmental efforts, and we believe they're unsatisfactory, particularly in terms of compliance with the recommendations of the Venice Commission. And we'll stay in touch and we'll provide you with more updates in the field. Thank you. Indeed, this reform is very important, is very topical, and let me remind the first recommendations that we have received only 2 points out of 10 in terms of the constitutional court reforms. That's the only reform which is assessed so low. Now, I would like to call upon our audience who joined us online and who are watching us at Facebook and at YouTube. Please send your questions in the comments to the video, and you can ask our experts about any questions that might be interesting for you. And I would like to continue the topic that was raised by Mihailo, And to mention that at certain point, the EU and the Venice Commission have a kind of favorable approach to Ukraine, or they may be demonstrating inconsistency of their actions. And I would like to ask our experts, what are the expectations of the EU side? Is there maybe any reforms that we should focus, and to underline that at certain questions our European partners have to be more consistent? So any colleagues, anyone willing to have any comments or response to this question? Mikhailo, Alexander, Sergey, please, you are very well invited if you have any colleagues. If I may, just a second. Sergey, please. I had troubles with connection, so I haven't heard the question. What are the expectations from the EU partners? Is there any reforms that they should focus on? Absolutely. Oh, of course. In terms of the reform of the judiciary system, it would be good if our European partners would understand that the reforms during the times of war could not be sort of degraded because of the war. I mean, if we want Ukraine to join the EU, then Ukraine has to be the EU member after the victory as well. So the EU should not be kind of lowering the bar because of some emotional aspects. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to set for any extraordinary conditions that we will not be complying or managing to comply. But on the part of the EU, we would like to have more consistency, I would say. And the second thing I wanted to mention, and the EU clearly understands that as an institution, but unfortunately, some of the member states are playing with that. So that's the minority question. And I believe this could be an artificial obstacle, not only in the beginning of the accession negotiations, but even after that. So that's the weak spot, I would say, in many processes of the European Union. And it's not only related to Ukraine, we have to be ready to that risks. And surely the EU has to understand that some of the countries might be abusing this minority issue in order to fulfill some of the goals of themselves that are not actually related to the issue of the protection of minorities. So thank you, Sergey. Yulia, please. Well, thank you. I will have to support Sergey's point and his assessment on the judicial sector reform and the reform of the minorities. And I believe that the questions of language, identity assessment, particularly when we do have challenges in resources, support, and with interpretation. So there could be some hidden interests and goals in place, and we have to understand this. They may be of the fulfillment of priorities, but I believe that this formal path with normal, effective documents, because we're doing that not only to satisfy someone, but to satisfy our own citizens and the society. So I believe that if we would have this position, then the other voices in the other countries that might be motivated by anything, they might think that we would need to support their minorities, or they might be, I don't know, verifying or inspecting or looking at other sources of information and be under the enemy's influence. So I think that anything that depends on us, we have to do that. And that's something that we are doing actually. And then the rest is all about the dialogue with the EU. and we have to prove it, we have to align that, and there has to be both the internal and external dialogue in place. Good. Any other comments? I do have a small comment with regards to the reestablishment of the e-declaration, and we've seen in the past about the attempts of the MPs to weaken the e-declaration situation. I'd like to say that despite the recommendation of the International Monetary Fund to simplify the e-declaration process, still those boundaries for simplification that could be taken by our MPs, in a way that it might destroy the whole kind of process of e-declaration and its effectiveness. So at this point, I would like to focus additional attention of our European platforms partners in order to prevent this from happening, because all these simplifications, they have to be properly substantiated and very carefully implemented. I would like to pass to a more kind of a positive predictions and forecasts, because we are saying that these 7 recommendations are designed to make Ukraine closer to the EU. So Alyona Hetmanchuk in the very beginning has mentioned that the fulfillment of 7 recommendations will not automatically open the doors for the accession talks, but this is our next step to the EU integration. So in May, June this year, the Ukraine is expecting to have an intermediate opinion of the European Commission on the status of these 7 reforms. So I question to these experts: do you think could there be any changes in terms of the implementation of the reforms over this remaining period? What else positive could we forecast that we have not mentioned in the candidate check? But any expectations you have on the part of the authorities over this month or two? Well, formally, there has to be a program approved as an implementation mechanism that is designed to fulfill certain priorities. So that's the first. And second, we need to wait for the Venice Commission, my opinion on the national minorities. And I believe it will set a trajectory for the next steps. So it's all kind of dynamically changing, and this priorities are shifting, are changing very fast. So do you think there could be some positive changes over a month or two?
Нам відомо ледь не не за 2 місяці, да,
We
там
are aware maybe 2 months ahead. By the end of May or in the beginning of January, we will see some unnecessary elements of implementation. So quite soon we are going to see the approved national concept, and there will be also consultations about the implementation programs. They are already being planned, and in case you are interested, you can get registered for the working groups. And Ukraine is indeed doing it in an open and transparent way and communicating about it. Alexander, please. So, in the upcoming months, the most probable change is the improvement on the money laundering and FAT standards, because we are already getting the signals. The government has already developed the draft law to reduce the impact of the public officials in PEPs, and indeed, despite the government's approval, it is the parliament that makes and approves the laws. So we would like to see at least the first reading passed, and ideally to have the law approved and signed, and hopefully resuming the declarations, especially in view of the memorandum with the IMF. This would be a good step. Okay, so I would like to hear from Mikhail Zhernakov because we could see that the final stage of selecting candidates for the high qualification commission. So, Mikhailo, are there any prospects of any positive dynamics in the upcoming time? Well, from what we are aware, this has indeed has started, and the discussions are already happening. We can see some specific features in the interviews that could show the effectiveness of this process. But also we can see that the High Council of Justice listens to the advice of the partners and the public. And well, in the upcoming couple of days or half a month, well, we are going to have this conclusion in the beginning of the next month. So there is a very high probability that we will finally have 16 members, 16 candidates selected because, well, we have 32 candidates, and among them we have those who will be able to select judges, and they are going to, well, fire 2,500 new judges that will be the future of Ukrainian justice. So there are some of those who can do it truly independently. In this case, they will not look like the alternatives of the system of justice, but also there are those who are probably not able to produce any meaningful change. So it is best for really fit people to take the positions. We will be watching this, and we encourage everyone to watch the interviews well because they are available and interested. Yes, if I'm not mistaken, they are open. Yes, you can watch this on YouTube on the profile of the High Council of Justice, and you can watch everything there. Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I would like to add that, as colleagues have mentioned, the experts in the candidate check are doing their best to make a balanced assessment, assessing not only the formal implementation. And my penultimate question before the final remarks. Um, in the majority of recommendations, we have quite high points, but is there any risk of reversibility of those reforms, and which reforms demand a special attention from the expert community? And what are you going to watch in the future? Yeah, colleagues, anyone? Sergey, maybe? Oksana? Well, the thing is, or these 7 blocks of recommendations, we have discussed them uh, quite a lot here, and in my specific field, uh, there is not much to watch over, but in a broader context of
Що взагалі виділяти щось.
Ukraine's EU integration, the number of fields are difficult to single out something specific. So the most important here is what the EU calls fundamentals, which means the fundamental values and the associated reforms. So whether we want it or not, the first block opened for Ukraine will be the last block that's going to be completed. That's because EU will be paying very close attention to this. So our government has to be ready for the systemic work in this area. But Euro integration is quite broad a process, so we cannot point out some one area. So yeah, so Sergei has mentioned fundamentals, the supremacy of law, and also since we know that in October we will have the EU report not only on these 6 items but on the broader issues, and we will also have fundamentals included. It's very important to have subsequent steps there because we understand that these activities that are included in the reload, it's not the end because to make sure that everything works effectively, we need to change the legislation, otherwise the disciplinary function will not be properly implemented. So for the proper selection of judges, we need to improve the selection procedure, making it more effective, more transparent, and especially very effective in the assessment of the integrity of judges. And it's very important to have this issue of public council of um, justice, which needs to be sufficient in the assessment of integrity. And also there is the issue of properly providing conditions for the members of the commission. So there are these limitations of 67 thousand hryvnias, and it is much less than what the professionals in the field are getting. And so, for instance, the judges in the courts can have a salary several times higher. So this is something that needs to be taken into account. Otherwise, if we, if we pay pittance, why should we expect people to produce some amazing job for this money? Alexander? Thank you. I believe that we need to watch the implementation of the government 2025 anti-corruption program. It has recently been approved, and it has albeit some minimal but still influence on the implementation of this recommendation through effective investigation. And we will have to work a lot to properly implement this document. And of course, the implementation of the rulings and there are certain activities that could contribute to the effectiveness of investigations and proper court proceedings. So this is something that we should watch in the future, the government anti-corruption program, because the previous government anti-corruption program was not implemented to 100%. And also the newly appointed senior executives of the anti-corruption institutions, they also have to approve the unbiased nature. Hey, and I believe we should pay attention on top of what we have discussed, the implementation of the priorities in the legislation amendments and implementation mechanisms. I believe that in the upcoming months, there could be the following risks. There can be some controversial assessment of the Venice Commission on the legislation about minorities. So we will see to which extent we will be able to adjust our legal decisions in the draft law. And also, the priority is quite complex because there are these narratives about different breaches of the minorities' rights in Ukraine. They are being disseminated by the Russians, but also the European politicians that basically also reiterate the Russian narratives about the limitation. Creates a certain informational backdrop for the implementation of this priority, not only here in Ukraine, but also in other countries. And I believe that we should also pay attention to this. I don't want to give some specific examples, but there are such cases, such options indeed. And one more risk is the possible increase of different um, uh, statements about the rights to education and other issues. I believe we should make certain steps to prevent negative consequences. So, for instance, approval of the legislation on legislation with the transitional period in terms of that plays some more considerable integration role in education. So we should do our thing and we should work against the fakes and wait for the decisions of the Council of Europe. Thank you, dear colleagues. Indeed, we need to do our thing, and the coalition of experts, of candidate check, will continue watching the implementation of reforms. It's been 10 months since we have started and since we have started providing recommendations. And right now, the overall assessment is a 6.8. And right now, let's give the speakers the floor for the final remarks. What's your general impression about Ukraine's progress over this last 10 months, the entire period of our candidate check? So I will speak not about my sector, but I will speak about the situation generally. So when we started the implementation, we were quite skeptical about government's expectations to be able to implement all the recommendations till the end of last year. So, of course, this actually did not happen. But though we were skeptical back then, right now we are more or less synchronized in terms of expectations. After the government saw the real implementation rates, they, well, I believe I'm speaking on behalf of the entire coalition. The current expectations of the government are in line with the expectations of the experts. So it's quite realistic to complete foreseeable times. So there are some issues with the anti-oligarchs legislation. There are some issues with our good neighbors, Hungary, so to speak. But these things don't fully depend on Ukraine. But as for all the rest, we can achieve the level of 8 to 10 out of 10 in all the recommendations by the time of the assessment in October, and then we should advocate the thing and make sure that we properly advocate the start of the negotiations, showing that we have done our homework. Thank you, Sergey. Any other colleagues? Do you have any final remarks? If no, we still have Mikhailo. Yeah, so it looks I have spoken a lot today, so right now I would like to just express gratitude to you, to the New Europe Center, and express hope that the government takes the action that our partners are counting on and have the achievements necessary for the timely start of negotiations. Thank you. So, yeah, as a summary of today's event and our expectations, we, the coalition of experts, remain steadfast in our um, eh, monitoring of the implementation, and we will be there till the end. So the results of the candidate check can be found on the New Europe Center website.